wet wool and cold ambassadors' anterooms, the flat glitter of a great man's ambition, and a foreign tongue nobody in the ballroom troubled to learn. That was the whole flavor of the marriage handed to Marguerite Lillet. For she had been chosen the way a rising man chooses a stepping stone, and set down again the moment he thought he saw a higher one. The Duke of Ravenscourt had married the quiet daughter of a dead diplomat to reach the great world, and then, believing her too grave and too foreign to help him reach it, had spent an entire London season pretending in company that he had not married her at all. What he did not know, what would cost him nearly everything to learn, was that the one door in England he most needed opened only to her hand, and that she had learned, at a court he had never bothered to ask her about, exactly what a man's ambition is worth when it is set against his word. To understand what he did, you must understand that Adrian Vane, 6th Duke of Ravenscourt, was not, in the ordinary way, a cruel man. He was 36, tall and dark and clever, and he was ambitious the way other men are thirsty, steadily, and without ever quite noticing that it governed him. His father had died a duke and nothing else, a great name spent on hounds and cards, and Adrian had grown up resolved that the name should mean something in his hands, that when he entered a room, the ministry should lean toward him. That history, when it came to be written, should be obliged to spell Ravenscourt. And in the spring of 1816, with the map of Europe still wet from its redrawing, he saw exactly the ladder he wanted. The little Grand Duchy of Osterwald, tucked between larger and hungrier neighbors, held a river and a mountain pass that Britain wished bound to her interest, and the ministry had let it be known, in the quiet way such things are known, that the man who could bring England the Osterwald Concord, the old Grand Duchess's signature on a treaty of friendship, would have the leading of the mission that followed, and after it very nearly anything he chose to ask. Adrian meant to be that man. He had, he believed, everything the work required: a great title, a quick tongue, a house made for entertaining, and the friendship of half the cabinet. What he lacked, he had decided by February, was the right wife at the foot of his table, and there he had made 3 years before a bargain he now regarded as a mistake. He had married Marguerite Lille for her father. Sir Henry Leasley had been the finest British minister of his generation at the small German courts, a man who did with patience and honesty what louder men could not do with fleets, and he had died abroad leaving a modest fortune, a great name among diplomats, and a daughter raised entirely at the court of Osterwald, where he had served longest and been loved best. Adrian, a younger and hungrier man then, had married the diplomat's daughter for the diplomat's connections, and had discovered on his wedding journey that he had got a wife who was grave and quiet, and spoke 4 languages in a low voice and English last of all, who watched a room the way her father had watched a treaty, and who did not, would not, could not be made to sparkle. She was 22 when he married her, and 25 now, dark-eyed and pale and still, with a composure that came from having grown up among sovereigns, and having learned young that the people who matter most in a room are very seldom the loudest in it. Adrian, who wanted above all things to be the loudest in every room, looked at his own wife across 3 years and saw a reproach he could not name and chose to call a liability. For the great world, he had come to believe, was not won by grave foreign stillness. It was won at the glittering political salons where reputations were made over supper, and the queen of those salons that season was Lady Honoria Frayne, brilliant, fair, tireless. A widow with a house always full of the men who governed England, and a genius for making each of them feel he was the cleverest creature she had ever heard. Adrian did not love her. He had learned from a first marriage entered coldly to keep love out of his arithmetic altogether. But he looked at Lady Honoria, dazzling a room of ministers, and thought, that is the instrument a rising man needs. And he looked at Marguerite, silent by the wall in her dark plain gown, and thought, that is the instrument I am saddled with. He never once thought to ask which of the two women actually knew the Grand Duchess of Osterwald. It did not occur to him that it might matter. He had stopped some time ago asking his wife anything at all. So he set about the season as if he were unmarried. He escorted Lady Honoria. He built his evenings around her salons. He let it be understood, in the elegant wordless way of his world, that the Duchess of Ravenscourt was of delicate health and disliked society, and left her at home. When he could not leave her at home, he seated her low and talked past her. And when some kind soul asked the grave Duchess a question, he answered it himself, briskly, before she could open her mouth, because he had persuaded himself that her slow, careful, foreign-flavored English made him look provincial, and a man who means to lead England abroad cannot afford to look provincial at home. Once, drawing on his gloves before a great reception, he saw the small grey enamel token she always wore on a narrow ribbon at her throat, no bigger than a shilling, worn thin at the edges, and asked her, not unkindly, merely to fill the carriage silence, what the bit of foreign tin was, and when she said quietly that it had been given her as a girl by the Grand Duchess of Osterwald, and that in that country it meant something, he had laughed, and said he hoped she would not wear her German trinket where English people might see it and think that. Ravenscourt's hard up, and told the coachman to drive on. She had put it away under her fichu, against her skin, and said nothing. He thought he had won a small point. He had, in fact, told the one person who could have made him that he did not wish to be made by her, and she had heard him, all the way down. What he never troubled to see was what the rest of the house saw plainly. He did not notice that the grave Duchess he was ashamed of had, within a year of coming, become the still centre the whole establishment turned to, that the servants brought her their troubles because she listened in 4 languages and shouted in none, that his motherless young half-brother, a shy ensign of 19 down from the north, had learned to sit in her room of an evening because it was the one room in the house where a boy need not perform. He did not notice that when a junior attach of the Osterwald legation, a homesick young man cut dead at a great crush for his clumsy English and his unfashionable coat, had stood scarlet and wretched against a pillar. It was the Duchess of Ravenscourt who crossed to him and spoke to him in his own tongue, and stood beside him, unhurried, until the room forgot to sneer, and that the young man had gone back to his mistress, the Grand Duchess, and told her, in a private letter, that the Liesel girl was here, and married to a cold English lord who did not seem to know what he had. Adrian noticed none of it. He was watching Lady Honoria's doors, and counting the ministers who came through them, and waiting for the Grand Duchess of Osterwald to arrive in England so that he might at last begin to climb. She arrived in May. The old Grand Duchess of Osterwald, 70, upright as a halberd, with a face like a fine cracked glaze and eyes that had outlasted 3 wars and a dozen cleverer men, came to London to be flattered and to decide, in her own time and her own way, whether the friendship England offered was worth an honest small country's name. The ministry set itself to charm her. Adrian set himself to charm her hardest of all. He gave that fortnight the greatest reception of his life, Ravenscourt House lit from cellar to attic, every man in the cabinet on the stairs, Lady Honoria beside him, in silver, at the head of it all. Magnificent, radiant, the visible proof that the Duke of Ravenscourt was a man the great world came to. He had, of course, been obliged to produce his wife for so public an occasion. He had put her in a gown she had not chosen, and a place near the door, and had asked her, low and quick in the crush before the doors opened, to be so good as not to bore the Grand Duchess with her German, if the old woman should chance to speak to her. Marguerite had looked at him a moment, with the dark level look he had never learned to read, and had said only, "I shall try to be no trouble to you," and he had taken it for meekness, and turned back to Lady Honoria, and never seen the thing that crossed her face, because he had never once in 3 years looked long enough to learn what her face did. The Grand Duchess came up the great stair a little before 11, and the whole reception arranged itself to receive her, the ministers, the ambassadors, the Duke resplendent, Lady Honoria a fall of silver light, the finest company in England, ranged to do a small sovereign honour. And the old woman came to the top of the stair and swept the glittering room once with her cold, clever eyes, and did not stop at the cabinet, and did not stop at the Duke, and did not stop for 1/2 second at the dazzling fair woman in silver, who stood ready with her most brilliant smile. She looked over all of it, the way a person looks over a laid table for the one dish she came for, and she found, standing quiet and unregarded by the door, in a gown that did not suit her, the grave dark-eyed daughter of Henry Lisle. And the Grand Duchess of Osterwald, before the assembled government of England, walked past the Duke with his own name on his lips, and past Lady Honoria with her curtsy half made, and crossed the whole length of that shining floor, and took both of Marguerite's hands in her old ringed ones, and said in the soft German of a small far country, in a voice suddenly and terribly gentle, "Child, they told me you were here. Henry's girl. Let me look at you." And she reached up, in front of them all, and touched with one finger the small grey enamel token at Marguerite's throat, the bit of foreign tin, and said, so that those near enough to understand it went very still, "You still wear it. Good. There is no one in this kingdom I would rather see wear it." The room did not know what it was seeing, and knew all at once that it was seeing everything. Adrian stood with his empty magnificence going cold on him like a suit of borrowed clothes, and watched the sovereign he had lit his whole house to flatter ignore him utterly, and weep. The old iron woman weep over the wife he had spent a season pretending not to have. He watched the cabinet watch it. He watched the ambassadors read, in one instant, the thing he had been 3 years too vain to read, that the Osterwald Concord, the ladder of his whole ambition, the treaty England had courted for a year, would be given or withheld by an upright old woman who trusted no Englishman living, and loved exactly one Englishwoman on earth, and that he had married her, and hidden her, and asked her not to embarrass him with her German. The floor of his certainties went out from under him without a sound. Somewhere at the edge of the ruin he was aware of Lady Honoria's smile curdling, of her understanding a beat before he fully did that she had backed the wrong horse in the wrong house, but he could not attend to that, because he was looking, for the first time in 3 years, at his own wife, really looking, the way a man looks at a thing he is about to understand he has lost, and seeing, where he had trained himself to see a grave foreign liability, the one person in the room, in the kingdom, that all the power he coveted bent toward. He got through the rest of that night on the strength of 36 years of breeding, and remembered almost none of it. He knew that the Grand Duchess kept Marguerite by her the whole evening, and spoke to no minister except through her, that men who had not troubled to bow to the Duchess of Ravenscourt in 3 years found occasion suddenly to be presented, that Lady Honoria left early. He knew that his wife did it all faultlessly, translated, softened, steered, was gracious to the very men who had cut her, and never once, by the flicker of an eyelash, looked to him for anything, because she had long ago stopped expecting to find help in his direction. And he knew, standing at his own hearth at 2 in the morning, with the candles guttering and the great house emptying of everyone who had come to see him and stayed to see her, that he had done something to his marriage that a single night could reveal, but not a single night undo. He went to her the next morning early, which he never did. He found her already at her writing table, in the plain grey she wore when he was not making her wear otherwise. Answering, he saw it upside down, a letter in the Grand Duchess's own hand, 3 pages of it, close and affectionate, and beginning with the German word for daughter. He stood in the door and, for the first time in the whole of their marriage, did not know how to begin. He said her name. Marguerite. It came out wrong, uncertain, a word he had used perhaps a dozen times in 3 years, and she looked up at him with a courteous, closed, perfectly pleasant face, the face one gives a caller, and waited to hear what the Duke required, and he understood, with a lurch, that he had taught her to look at him exactly so, that this careful civility was a thing he had built, brick by brick, out of 3 years of talking past her. He tried to say that he had not understood. She heard him out, and then she told him, gently and without a particle of malice, the truth, which was worse than any reproach. She said that he had understood perfectly, that he had simply never thought it worth his while to ask what she was, because he had decided at the outset what she was for, and had found her useless for it, and set her down. She said it as one states a fact of law. She had grown up, she reminded him quietly, in a court where she watched exactly this: men who priced everyone by use, and were always, in the end, surprised by the bill. Her father had taught her the difference between a man who wanted her country's friendship and a man who wanted a rung to stand on, and she had known within a month of marrying which he was, and had made her peace with it, and had not looked to be otherwise. She was not angry. That was the thing that frightened him. There was no wound in her he could press and be forgiven for pressing. There was only a great, level, finished calm, the calm of a woman who did her counting long ago and has merely been waiting, these 3 years, out of courtesy, for the sum to come due. And it was coming due now, and they both knew it, because the Grand Duchess of Osterwald had made it plain to the whole of London that she would treat with England through no one but Henry Liesel's daughter, and the ministry which cared for results and not for a duke's domestic vanities had already begun. Adrian could feel it happening around him like a change of weather, to root the entire Osterwald business through the Duchess of Ravenscourt. The ladder he had built his season to climb had turned out to be his wife, and he had spent that season sawing at it. What followed was the strangest and most wretched fortnight of the Duke's life, in which a man who had never in his days had to earn a thing he wanted set out, clumsily and far too late, to earn the one thing he had thrown away, and found that all the coin he was used to spending had suddenly become worthless in the only shop that mattered. He tried at first the ways he knew. He tried to make her his instrument now that she had turned out to be a valuable one, came to her with the ministry's messages and the cabinet's hopes, laid the great work before her as though the discovery that she was useful had healed everything, and asked her, man to colleague, to secure the Concord for England, and he could not keep it out of his voice. For him. Marguerite set down her pen and looked at him for a long moment, and said that she would do everything in her power for England, and for the old woman who had been a mother to her, and for the small, honest country her father had loved, and that she would do precisely none of it for him, and that he should understand the difference clearly, because it was the whole of the difference between them. She would not be his stepping stone any more than she had consented to be his ornament. He had wanted a wife who was of use to his climbing. He was welcome, she said, to watch her be of use to something better than his climbing, and to draw from that whatever lesson he could. He tried, then, to buy his way back, because buying was the language he had. He offered her, awkwardly, the things a duke offers. Jewels she declined. A great settlement in her own name she thanked him for, and left unsigned. The promise of any establishment she pleased. He offered at last the one thing he thought no woman could refuse, to make her the visible partner of his rise, to bring her up beside him into the great world, to give her the standing he had denied her, now that it profited him to give it. And she looked at him with something that was very nearly pity, and said that he still did not understand, that a woman offered a place at a man's side because she has become useful to his ambition, is being valued at exactly the price she was refused for, only the figure has changed, that she had been set down as worthless to his climb, and was now being taken up as precious to it, and that both of these were the same man pricing the same woman by the same rule, and she was done, entirely and for good, with being a thing that a man weighed. Her worth, she told him, had never once altered between February and May. Only his need had, and she was not going to spend the rest of her life as the answer to his need. He dismissed Lady Honoria in a single interview, and took no pleasure in it. She came to him, clever and unfrightened, and proposed in effect that they were two of a kind, and might yet be useful to each other, whatever tiresome turn the Osterwald affair had taken. And Adrian looked at the brilliant, ambitious woman he had spent a season courting and saw, with the cold new clarity of a man learning to see, exactly what he had nearly become, a person for whom every other person was a rung, and told her civilly that he found he no longer cared to rise by anyone's help, and least of all by hers, and wished her a good evening. She went, and he felt nothing, and understood grimly that the one thing he had proved that whole spring was that he could feel nothing for the wrong woman with perfect ease. The nights were the worst of it. He would lie awake in the great house, and hear, faintly, the murmur of his wife's voice from her sitting room, where the young Osterwald attach, and his own shy half-brother, and sometimes the old Grand Duchess herself, sat late over the maps and the drafts, working the honest, slow diplomacy her father had taught her, making a treaty the way you make anything that lasts, patiently and without a single lie, and he, the Duke of Ravenscourt, who had married the great world and hidden it in a back room, lay in the dark on the wrong side of a door he had built, and listened to the thing he wanted most going on, brilliantly, warmly, entirely without him. He caught himself, one such night, jealous, savagely, absurdly jealous, of a homesick young attach, of his own brother, of an old woman of 70, of everyone permitted inside that lamplit room, and lay there with the ugly heat of it under his breastbone, and made himself for once name it truly, and found at the bottom of the jealousy not vanity at all, but the plain, unbearable fact that he wanted to be let in, that he had, at some point he could not fix, and entirely without meaning to, come to love his own wife. The grave, dark-eyed woman he had married for her father, and hidden for her stillness, and had made himself, with 3 years of steady care, the one person in England she had no reason on earth to let through the door. The Concord was signed in the middle of June, in the Long Gallery at Ravenscourt House, and it was the making of England's whole northern policy for a generation, and everyone in that room knew whose work it was. The old Grand Duchess set her name to it, with Marguerite standing at her shoulder, and when it was done she rose, and took from her own breast a great enamelled star of the first Ostwald order, the real one, the sovereign's own, the thing the small grey token was only the child's shadow of, and pinned it, before the government of England, upon the Duchess of Ravenscourt, and said, dry and clear so all could hear it in French this time, that she gave it where it was owed, to the truest friend her house had in the world, and that England might have her friendship, and might thank for it the one Englishwoman worth the trouble of trusting. And the ministry came then to the Duke, came to Adrian with the leading of the mission in their hands, the very prize, the ladder's top, ready to name the Duke of Ravenscourt to the great appointment his whole season had been built to win. And Adrian Vane, standing in his own gallery with the enamelled star burning on his wife's breast, and the whole thing he had wanted held out to him at last, understood that it had never been his to take, that the appointment was being offered to him because he happened to be married to the woman who had earned it, that he had in plain fact been about to accept as the crown of his ambition, a thing that belonged wholly to somebody he had spent 3 years teaching to expect nothing from him. And he did the first entirely honest thing of his life. He told the ministry before the Grand Duchess, before the cabinet, before his wife, that the work was not his, and the credit was not his, and the trust was not his, that if England wished to keep Osterwald's friendship, England must deal, as Osterwald plainly wished to deal, with the Duchess of Ravenscourt in her own right and by her own name, and that he would take no appointment, no rung, no reward that was in truth hers, and had never been anything but hers. It cost him, visibly, the whole of what he had lived for. He gave it up in a sentence, in public, and did not look while he did it, to see whether it earned him anything, because he had learned that much at least, that a thing done in order to be worth someone is still a thing with a price on it, and he was trying, clumsily for the first time, to do something that had no price on it at all. He went to her that night in her sitting room, knocked, which he had never done, and waited to be told to come in, which he had never done either. The lamps were low, and the great enamelled star lay carelessly on the table, beside the small grey token, the sovereign's own order, and the bit of foreign tin side by side, and she was sitting quietly among her papers, looking at nothing, tired the way people are tired, after a thing they have carried a long way is finally set down. He did not offer her jewels, or a settlement, or a place at his side, or the great world. He came and stood, and then, because he did not know how else to say it, he took the small grey token up off the table, the thing he had once called foreign tin, and told her to hide, and he held it in his open hand between them. And he said, in a voice with nothing left in it but the truth, I married you to reach the great world, and the great world was in the room with me the whole time, wearing a grey gown by the door, and I told it not to embarrass me. I have spent 3 years teaching the best thing that ever came to me, that it was worth nothing, and I taught the lesson thoroughly, and I cannot unteach it. And I will not insult you by pretending it can be unsaid. I know exactly what I am worth to you, because I built the figure myself, night after night, with my own mouth, and it is a small one, and it is just. I have no right on earth to ask you to stay. I am asking. Not because you are useful to me. God knows you are. And God knows I do not deserve the use of you, but because somewhere in the middle of being a fool, I came to love the one person I had made certain would never believe it. I know it is too late to be believed. I would rather say it too late than never have been man enough to say it at all. And Marguerite Lisle, who had done her counting 3 years before and closed the sum, looked at him for a long moment with the dark level eyes that had watched sovereigns, and was not made of stone. That was the thing he would remember. That something crossed her face that might, in another marriage begun another way, have been the beginning of everything. But she did not reopen a finished sum lightly, and she did not intend to be taken up now for the same reason she had been set down, only inverted. So she told him the truth, which was the only currency she had ever trusted. She said that she believed him. That was the hard gift, and she gave it plainly. She believed he meant it, and thought, even, that it might be true. But belief, she said, was not the whole of the debt. He had taught her, patiently, exactly what it was to be valued by use, and a man who now valued her use very highly indeed had not yet proved he could value anything else, and she had grown up among men who could not, and had buried the one man she ever knew who could. And she was not going to hand her life to a maybe. She would not, she said, be his instrument, nor his ornament, nor his ladder, nor his answered prayer. If there was to be a marriage, a real one, the kind her father had, the kind worth the name, it would be between 2 people who each owned themselves outright, and it would begin only when he had learned, not for a fortnight, but for as long as it took her to believe it, to see a person as a person and not as a use. And she would not promise him the end of that road from the near side of it. She could promise only that she would watch, honestly and without pretending, and that if the man she was beginning, just possibly, to glimpse turned out to be real and to last, then the door, she looked at it, the door he had at last learned to knock upon, the door would not be locked. But he was to understand that she was keeping the key. She had kept it 3 years. She meant to go on keeping it, whatever came. Because a woman who has been priced twice by the same man learns that the one thing no one can set a figure to is the thing she must never let out of her own hand. And she reached out and closed his fingers gently over the small grey token, and told him to keep it, not as a trophy, she said, and not as a penance, but as a reminder of the day the whole world walked past him to a woman he had told to hide, so that he might never again make the mistake of thinking he could tell what a thing was worth by whether it was of use to him. And Adrian Vane closed his hand around the bit of foreign tin and bowed his head, and did the hardest thing a proud man is ever asked to do, which was to accept a chance he had not earned and might yet fail to earn, and to be grateful and to wait. It was not a fairy tale, and she did not mean it to be. He did not win her back in a night, because she was not a thing to be won, there is no such word, in the language she was raised in, for a person. But he set himself, from that midsummer on, to the long, unglamorous work of becoming a man worth the key she kept, and because there was no audience for it now, and no ladder at the top of it, it was, at last, real. He served the Osterwald mission under her, and let the world know whose it was, and grew over years into the one thing his ambition had never once aimed at, which was a man of use to his country instead of to himself. And Marguerite, watching honestly and without pretending, unlocked the door by slow degrees, in her own time, on her own terms, keeping the key always in her own hand, until a season came, a long while after, when the Duke and Duchess of Ravenscourt were spoken of quietly as the rarest thing in that hard, bright world, a match that had begun as a bargain and become a marriage, and no one but the two of them, and a dry old sovereign far away who had seen it first, ever knew that the whole of it turned on a single night when the great world crossed a shining floor, walked past a duke, and stopped for the woman he had hidden by the door. He kept the token to the end of his life, long after the Grand Duchess was dead, and the enamelled star of the First Osterwald Order lay locked away with the other honours neither of them cared for. The small grey-worn thing on its narrow ribbon stayed where he could reach it. And when at last he was an old man and someone, a grandchild, a secretary, it does not matter, asked the Duke why so great a house should treasure so plain and foreign a scrap, worth nothing, he told them the truth, which was the last lesson he had to leave. Because it is the only star in England worth the wearing, said the Duke of Ravenscourt, and I very nearly threw it in the gutter for being cheap. There was a woman once who wore it by a door, and the whole world knew her for what she was, and I was the last man in the kingdom to learn it, and she taught me at a cost I am still paying and glad to pay. You cannot tell what a thing is worth by whether it is of use to you. I know that now. It only took me the whole of my life, and the nearest possible thing to losing everything, and a bit of foreign tin she was kind enough, in the end, to let me keep. If this story of a proud man and the wife he priced too low held you to the last of the light, do a kind thing for the tellers of it. Press the like, and share it with a fellow lover of grounded historical romance and slow, deeply drawn drama. Subscribe to The Duke's Undoing, so you never miss the next chapter of a powerful man learning, too late or almost too late, exactly what he threw away. And tell us below, for we read every answer. She believed his repentance, and still she kept the key and made him earn the door. Was she right to give a changed man a chance, but never a promise? Or should genuine, ruinous, too late love be trusted the moment it is finally spoken?